I never thought much about eye contact until Ezra made it impossible to ignore. We were paired together for organic chemistry lab at the start of fall semester, one of those random assignments where the TA just reads names off a list, and suddenly you're spending 3 hours twice a week with a complete stranger. When Professor Chen called out my name, Adrian, and then his, Ezra looked up from across the room, and our eyes met for maybe 2 seconds, before he gave this small nod and gathered his stuff to move to my bench. That was it. Just a normal interaction between lab partners who'd be measuring pH levels and titrating solutions together for the next 4 months. Except, it wasn't normal at all, and I just didn't know it yet. Ezra was the kind of person who seemed completely comfortable in his own skin, which I envied immediately. He had this messy dark hair that fell into his eyes when he leaned over the lab manual, and he'd push it back without thinking, leaving his safety goggles slightly crooked. He wore the same faded hoodie at least twice a week, the one with the astronomy department logo that had definitely seen better days. And he smiled easily, especially when he was explaining something he found interesting, which turned out to be pretty much everything we studied. The first few weeks were fine. We fell into a rhythm. He was better at the theoretical stuff, could explain reaction mechanisms while sketching molecular structures on scrap paper. His handwriting surprisingly neat for someone who seemed so casual about everything else. I was more precise with the actual experiments, better at following protocols and keeping our data organized. We worked well together. We made a good team. I told myself that was all it was. Then came the presentations. Our first one was on acid-base equilibria. Nothing too complicated, just 15 minutes in front of the class explaining our experimental results. We'd practiced once in the library the night before, running through our slides and dividing up who would say what. Ezra would handle the introduction and theory, I'd present the methodology and results, then he'd wrap up with conclusions. Simple, straightforward. Except when we actually stood up there in front of everyone, something shifted. I was talking about our titration procedure, pointing at the graph on the screen behind us, when I glanced over at Ezra to transition to the next slide. He was already looking at me, not at the screen, not at the class, at me. And when our eyes met, he didn't look away. He just held my gaze with this expression I couldn't quite read, something soft and attentive and completely focused, like I was the only person in the room. It lasted maybe 3 seconds, maybe 4, but it felt longer. Long enough that I lost my place in what I was saying and had to glance down at my notes to remember where I was. My face felt hot. I stumbled through the next sentence, hyper-aware of him standing there beside me, hyper-aware of the fact that I could feel his presence without even looking at him. When I finally managed to finish my section, and he stepped forward to present the conclusions, his shoulder brushed against mine as we switched positions. Just barely, just enough that I felt it through my lab coat. I told myself I was imagining things, reading into normal interactions because I was nervous about public speaking, except I wasn't nervous about public speaking. I'd given plenty of presentations before. This was something else entirely. After class, as we were packing up our stuff, Ezra asked if I wanted to grab coffee. We'd gotten coffee before, plenty of times, usually to work on lab reports or study for exams. This felt different somehow. Or maybe I was just making it different in my head. Either way, I said yes. We ended up at the campus coffee shop, the one that's always too crowded and plays indie music just a little too loud. Ezra ordered some complicated drink with oat milk and an extra shot of espresso. I got my usual black coffee, which made him laugh and say something about how that was very on brand for me. I didn't know I had a brand, but apparently I did. We found a table by the window, and for a while we just talked about normal things. The lab, classes, the fact that Professor Chen had the most monotone voice known to humanity. But then there was this pause, this moment of quiet, and Ezra was looking at me again with that same expression from the presentation. Intent, focused, like he was trying to figure something out. "Do I make you nervous?" he asked, and it was so direct, so unexpected, that I almost choked on my coffee. "What?" "No. Why would you make me nervous?" He shrugged, but he was smiling slightly like he knew something I didn't. "You just seemed flustered up there, during the presentation." I was not flustered. You definitely were. You forgot what you were saying right in the middle of explaining the methodology. He'd noticed. Of course he'd noticed. I tried to play it off, said something about how the projector was too bright and it threw me off, which was a terrible excuse and we both knew it. Ezra just nodded slowly, still with that small smile, and took a sip of his overly complicated coffee. The thing is, I'd been aware of Ezra as a person from the start. He was smart and funny and easy to talk to. But somewhere between those first few weeks and that presentation, something had shifted in how I saw him. Or maybe it had shifted in how I let myself see him. Suddenly I was noticing things I'd been carefully not noticing before. The way he'd bite his bottom lip when he was concentrating on a problem. How his eyes crinkled at the corners when he really laughed. Not just the polite chuckle he gave in class, but the genuine laugh that came out when something actually amused him. The fact that he smelled like cedar and something citrusy, probably his shampoo or cologne, and I only knew that because I'd been standing close enough to notice. I started looking forward to lab in a way that had nothing to do with chemistry. I'd catch myself checking the time on Tuesdays and Thursdays, anticipating those 3 hours where we'd be working side by side, our elbows occasionally bumping as we reached for the same piece of equipment, his voice low when he'd lean in to ask if I was seeing the same results he was getting. Our second presentation was on reaction kinetics. We prepared for it the same way, meeting in the library to practice, dividing up the content. But this time I was bracing myself for that moment when our eyes would meet. I told myself I wouldn't get flustered. I'd be prepared. I wasn't prepared. It happened again, except worse. Better. I don't even know. I was explaining our rate law calculations when I transitioned to him, and he was already watching me, and this time when our eyes met he smiled. Not a big smile, just this small, almost private expression, like we were sharing a secret that no one else in the room knew about. And I forgot how to breathe for a second. Just completely forgot the basic biological function of oxygen exchange. I managed to get through it without completely falling apart, but afterward, when we were leaving the building, Ezra caught my arm. Just lightly, his fingers on my elbow, but it stopped me in my tracks. "Adrian," he said, and the way he said my name, careful and deliberate, made my heart do something complicated in my chest. "Can I ask you something?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. "Do you feel it too?" Such a simple question. 4 words. But it contained everything I'd been trying not to think about for weeks. The awareness. The tension. The way the air felt different when we were together. I could have played dumb, asked him what he meant, forced him to spell it out. But I was tired of pretending I didn't know exactly what he was talking about. "Yeah," I said quietly. "I feel it." His hand was still on my arm and he didn't let go. His thumb moved slightly, just a small movement against the fabric of my jacket, but I felt it like electricity. We were standing outside the chemistry building, students walking past us on their way to class, and all I could focus on was the point where his hand touched my arm, and the way he was looking at me like I was something precious. "I don't usually do this," he said. "Get distracted by my lab partner, but you make it really difficult to focus on chemistry." I laughed, and it came out shakier than I intended. "You hide it well. You seem perfectly focused during lab. That's because I'm very good at pretending." He let go of my arm then, but only so he could run his hand through his hair, that nervous gesture I'd seen him do 100 times. But I'm not sure I want to pretend anymore. We started meeting outside of lab after that, and we stopped pretending it was just to study. Coffee turned into dinner. Dinner turned into long walks across campus where we'd talk about everything except chemistry. I learned that Ezra wanted to go to grad school for astrophysics, that he'd been obsessed with space since he was 8 years old, that he could name constellations without even trying. He learned that I was pre-med mostly because it seemed like the practical choice, but what I really loved was writing, that I had notebooks full of short stories I'd never shown anyone. "Tell me one," he said one night when we were sitting on a bench near the library, the campus quiet around us, street lamps casting orange light across the pathway. "They're not very good," I protested. "I don't care. I want to know the stories you think about." So I told him about one I'd been working on, about a guy who could see people's emotions as colours, and how overwhelming it was to live in a world that bright. Ezra listened without interrupting, his full attention on me in that way that made me feel like I was the most interesting person he'd ever met. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "That's beautiful," he said finally. "Sad, but beautiful. Kind of how I feel right now," I admitted before I could stop myself. He turned to look at me fully. "Sad? No. Beautiful. Overwhelming. Like everything's too bright and too much and I don't know how to process it all. I knew we were talking about more than just the story. We were talking about this thing between us that had grown from those long glances during presentations into something I couldn't ignore anymore. Something that kept me awake at night thinking about the way his hand had felt on my arm, wondering what it would be like to close the distance between us. "Adrian," Ezra said, and his voice was soft, careful. "Can I kiss you?" I'd never been asked that before, never had someone give me that choice so clearly, so respectfully. And maybe that's when I really fell, not during the presentations or the coffee dates or the late-night conversations, but in that moment when he asked permission to cross that line, when he made it safe for me to want what I wanted. "Yes," I said. He kissed me like he did everything else, with complete attention and focus, his hand coming up to cut my jaw, his lips soft against mine. It was gentle and unhurried, and when we pulled apart, he rested his forehead against mine, both of us breathing a little unsteadily. "I've wanted to do that since the first presentation," he whispered, when I forgot what I was saying, especially then. "You looked so flustered and adorable, and I knew I was in trouble." We had one more presentation that semester on chemical equilibrium and Le Chatelier's principle. We practiced like always, met in the library, divided up the content. But this time when we stood up in front of the class and our eyes met, I didn't get flustered. I smiled. He smiled back, and when his shoulder brushed mine as we switched positions, it felt like coming home. After class, Professor Chen stopped us on our way out. "You two have excellent chemistry together," she said, completely oblivious to the irony of her statement. "Best lab partnership I've seen in years." Ezra caught my eye, and I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing. "Thank you, Professor," he said, somehow keeping his voice completely serious. We worked really well together. That night, lying in my dorm room, I thought about how strange it was that something as simple as eye contact could change everything. How I'd spent weeks trying to convince myself I was imagining the connection between us, that the way my heart raced when Ezra looked at me was just nervousness or caffeine or anything other than what it actually was. How scary and wonderful it felt to stop pretending, to let myself want something I'd never let myself want before. My phone buzzed with a text from Ezra. "Still awake?" "Yeah," I typed back. "Come downstairs." I pulled on shoes and headed down to find him waiting outside my building, hands in the pockets of that faded astronomy hoodie, looking up at the sky. When he heard me approach, he turned and smiled, and I felt that same flutter in my chest that I'd felt during our first presentation, except now I knew what it meant. "Couldn't sleep," he said. "Wanted to see you." We walked to the quad and lay down on the grass looking up at the stars. Ezra pointed out constellations, telling me their stories, his voice warm in the darkness. I wasn't really paying attention to the stars, though. I was thinking about how a semester ago I didn't know him, and now I couldn't imagine not knowing him. How sometimes the best things come from random TA assignments and eye contact that lasts a little too long. "What are you thinking about?" Ezra asked, turning his head to look at me. "You," I said honestly. "How glad I am that Professor Chen paired us together." He reached over and took my hand, lacing our fingers together. Best random assignment of my life. We lay there for a while longer, hands linked, watching the sky, and I realized that this was what those stories I wrote were always trying to capture. This feeling of connection, of being seen and understood, of finding someone who looks at you like you matter. I'd been writing about it for years without really knowing what it felt like. Now I knew, and it was better than any story I could have imagined. It was real and complicated and sometimes scary, but it was mine, ours, built on chemistry lab and presentations and eye contact that lasted just a little too long until it became exactly as long as it needed to be.